Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Holly M. Crawford, and I am the Director of Adult Public Programs at LACMA. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to present this conversation series, Conversing with Collections, New Spins on Ceramics, in conjunction with Conversing in Clay, Ceramics from the LACMA Collection. This three-part conversation series pairs LACMA curators and contemporary artists working in clay to explore how historical ceramics continue to inspire artists today. Please visit lacma.org for more information about this exciting series. Conversing in Clay, Ceramics from the LACMA Collection is co-curated by Staci Steinberger, Associate Curator, Decorative Arts and Design at LACMA, and Rosie Mills, the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Associate Curator, Decorative Arts and Design at LACMA. Just a little housekeeping before we jump into the program today. This program is being recorded and will be available to view at a future date. Closed captioning is available on the lower right-hand side if you are using Zoom on a computer. Our panelists are happy to answer a few questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A function and we will get to as many as possible. And at this time, I'd like to invite Staci Steinberger to the virtual stage to provide an overview of the exhibition and introduce today's panelists.
Thank you, Holly. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We're so excited to have the opportunity to speak with artist Julia Kunin about some of the amazing and wide-ranging works in LACMA's collection and how they relate to her practice. The program grew out of the exhibition Conversing in Clay, Ceramics from the LACMA Collection, which, as Holly mentioned, I co-curated with my colleague Rosie Mills. The exhibition is structured around 14 juxtapositions, each placing historical works in clay into dialogue with contemporary works in order to examine and to illuminate symbolic meanings, technical achievements, and other connections between them. In some cases, these are relationships directly intended by the artists, while in others, we believe that installing seemingly disparate works together would provide new insights on both. It certainly did for us, as we talked to colleagues, looked at dozens of works, and researched the collections to develop these groupings. We deepened and expanded our own understanding of both the historical and contemporary collections. Next slide. And one of the great pleasures of organizing this exhibition was the opportunity to talk to the artists themselves, to learn more about their practices and how works in LACMA's collection, and their works in LACMA's collection. And in the process of hearing how they thought about their work in the context of the history of the medium, what kinds of works interested them, what they were looking at, and how they conducted their own research. So for Conversing with Collections conversation series, we decided to turn over the reins to the artists themselves, inviting 3 of them to delve into the museum's vast ceramic holdings and select works that spoke to them and the way they approached their own practice, looking at these objects not only as records of the past, but providing their own distinctive perspective and questions to these works through the lens of someone who understands the act of making. So today, we're thrilled to be speaking with the artist Julia Kunin, whose sensual sculpture Indigo Garden is shown here. We'll be talking more about it, along with the intricate French plate in the center and the beautiful Jaunay Hungarian vessel shown alongside it in today's conversation. But first, a little more about the artist. Julia Kunin's otherworldly and often semi-figurative forms have sensual iridescent surfaces that are even more animated with the introduction of light. Her ceramic sculptures embrace the scientific, natural, and geological in form, but her use of rare Hungarian glazes references the opulence of the Baroque. Some works bring to mind mystical scholars' rocks, volcanic formulations, and ocean floors. Kunin lives and works in Brooklyn, New York, and also works in Hungary, where she conducts research and develops new work. She received her BA from Wellesley College and MFA from Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers University. She's exhibited extensively in Europe as well as in the United States and has been the recipient of numerous honors and awards. She was a Fulbright Scholar to Hungary in 2013, the recipient of a 2010 Trust for Mutual Understanding grant to Hungary. In 2008, she received the Paul Krasner Foundation grant and had a residency at Art Omni. And in 2007, received the John Michael Kohler Arts and Industry Artist Residency and has received numerous fellowships, more than I can list here. Her work has been featured in Art News, The Brooklyn Rail, and Harmony Hammond's book, Lesbian Art in America, and most recently in the September issue of Art in America in an article on sculpture by Glenn Adamson. She's had numerous solo exhibitions, most recently Rainbow Dream Machine at McLean Gallery in Houston. And her work has been included in exhibitions at the Museum of Art and Design in New York, the Museum of Applied Art and Design in Frankfurt, Germany, the Sculpture Center in New York, the Brattleboro Museum in Vermont, among others. And most recently, her group show just closed, two-person show at Mother Gallery in New York. And she has several other shows in the works. So look for her work in Conversing in Clay, as well as elsewhere. And with that, I'm excited to bring Julia onto the screen so we can start talking about some of the works that inspired her and interested her in LACMA's collection. Next slide. So the first piece we wanted to talk about was the piece actually that we selected for the exhibition. And what we have here is a 17th century French plate made in the tradition of scientist and ceramist Bernard Palissy. Of course, Palissy famously cast living and recently dead specimens in his work. His later followers, who continued to develop these techniques for centuries, also cast fossils, and you can see that in this example here. And so I know that Palissy was an early influence on you. And so maybe we can start by talking about what first drew you to this type of work and how you began to incorporate casting in your own practice.
Thank you very, very much, Staci. And before I get into that, I just want to thank Staci Steinberger and Rosie Mills for curating this extraordinary exhibition. And I'm honored to be, in the company of such great works of art and artists that are making work today. And thank you very much to LACMA. And I did get a chance to tour the exhibition. It's really exciting. About Palissy, I just have to say that it was a chance encounter with his work. I have a background in clay and was trying to solve a sculpture problem in around 2002, and decided that I needed to make clay octopi. I had moved away from making work that was centered on female sexuality, said, I'm done with that, it's over. I'm going to use animals as metaphor. And I realized, and I did octopi in glass, and I thought, I can't touch it. This is not fun. It's too hard. I need 20 years to learn how to make them myself. So I thought, I need to find a place that can help me learn how to make a mold of an octopus. I knew that that was the animal form I wanted to work with, because to me, it represented both male and female sexuality and was a little ambiguous and could be symbolic. So I walked into this pottery shop on Hope Street in Williamsburg. And, I just thought to myself, this looks like a wonderful, warm place. And I found someone that I could ask a question of. And I said, do you know anybody who can teach me how to make a mold of an octopus? Well, ceramic communities are very inviting and, it's different from the art world. And I was fortunate enough, yes, to find someone. He said, absolutely. And he basically showed me a book of works by Bernard Palissy and said that he would teach me how to make a press mold of a real octopus so that I can then figure out how to make them. He said, it's much easier to make a press mold. And that's what Bernard Palissy did as well. And Palissy, in the 16th century found works from nature because he was interested in science and wanted to create an environment, a scientific environment, a beautiful environment of the pond. Anyway, I just delved right into it. And then it wasn't just interested in casting an octopi or an octopus form. My goal was to pile them up. So if you go to the next slide, and we can talk about Palissy some more, because I had sort of this gut instinct of wanting to pile the octopi. And just like many artists, you just want to know what's going to happen. You want to find out. And what I discovered is that the work started to resemble scholars' rocks, and they started to resemble miniature worlds and grottos. And then when I found out, I did some more research on Palissy to find out that he himself had worked on a grotto. So I felt very connected to Palissy because of the sort of ceramic being artificial and connecting with the artifice of nature, but at the same time, connecting to the natural world and science, belief in science.
That's interesting in sort of looking at your work in comparison to the work in the show, because as we talked about a bit this morning when we were looking at the work together, the Palissy work almost has the sense of specimens all laid out. You can see them each individually, whereas in your work, as you mentioned, they're really piled and clustered. And I wonder if you could talk about why that impulse to pile them together was important to you.
Well, it's for many reasons. I was interested in abstraction. How do you create an abstract form by piling up realist forms so that when you stand back from green mansions, basically you just see some movement. And movement is very important to me in the work. I wanted it to feel alive. So you're really actually using the movement that is inherent in the octopus itself, and yet creating an abstract form. And these scholars' rocks eventually, these forms started to become figurative, which led me to further bodies of work. But the piling really was instinctual, but it also is about piling bodies. These are octopi. But I want to add one more thing, though, before we get too serious with the piling, but I want to get back to our next slide. But the reason I chose the octopus is because I'd seen the print by Hokusai called The Fisherman's Wife. And in that, you see the eroticism of the octopi being used. And so that's basically also what I was referencing. But you can go to the next slide. Or did you want to say, you want to ask a question?
No, actually, I think that's actually a perfect transition because, of course, in talking about these piled forms, that also brought us to talking about another artist who had interested you, sort of early in your career, which is Annabeth Rosen. And here we see her work from 1998, where you see these forms and fragments all piled together. And I wondered if you could talk about, what interested you about her work, and maybe a bit about, we went and saw these works. You went and saw these works yesterday, and maybe you can talk a little bit about seeing this work in person and sort of what that experience was like.
Yeah, first of all, yes, I just have to say that it was a very, very memorable experience seeing Annabeth Rosen's show at Nancy Margolis Gallery. And it was probably around 1998 or 97 or 99, around that time period. And little did I know that that work would remain part of my well of resources and come to mind when I started to pile the octopi. And then I realized that maybe I was actually inspired truly by Annabeth's work. I'm really taken by its chunkiness, the fragmentation. And when I looked at this in the image and when I looked at it in person, which was extraordinary, I really did see a piling of bones. I know that Annabeth is interested also in the natural world too. So there's a connection between flora and fauna and the living, the dead, the decadent, the abundance of something in terms of a way of seeing it as decadent, but also in terms of decay. If you look at Annabeth's work, you'll see that the glaze is wearing away and revealing the red clay underneath. So she finds a fragment. She's a prolific maker. She finds a fragment in her studio. It inspires her to make something. And I'll just say to artists out there, you just never know when somebody else's artwork is going to inspire you. And I want to, thank you, Annabeth. And also, I've been able to follow her work over the years, and it's really tremendous.
Well, I think surface is something interesting to talk about here. Obviously, the sort of surface and the sense of the work wearing away, of it being a fragment that she really embraces. Those sort of what might otherwise seem like accidents, that really becomes part of the quality of the work, and the sense of, as you said, almost feeling like decay, which is something we did talk about also with the Palissy, that those were rendered, to be as lifelike as possible. That was very important to him in his religious belief, in the sense of those as lifelike specimens that would survive and be preserved. The surfaces of your own work are quite different, but I know that you've talked about that this interest in preservation and decay, that sort of dichotomy is something that's interesting to you as well.
Very, very much so. What is the next? The next
image, if we want to get to it, is Gargantua. Do you want to look at that?
Okay. Yes, because it relates to both Green Mansions and Annabeth's work, in that this time. And there's so much to say because this was made at the Jolnai factory, and LACMA placed my work, Staci and Rosie placed my work in between two of the largest influences, one being Jolnai and one being Palissy. And then you combine that with the contemporary work of Annabeth Rosen. And there are many influences, but Gargantua for me represents my kind of achieving the holy grail of glazes. And I didn't achieve it myself in the sense, but I was able to use it. Gargantua is monstrous, and it's named after, you know, a Rabelaisian character, but it's covered with butterfly wings and worms and snails and snakes and things that look grotesque, sort of emerging from a figure. I took a leap from the Scholar's Rock figurative quality to actually making a intentional head shape, although there's geometric forms on the bottom. So it too is abstract from a distance, but it is also playing with using the Jaulnay luster glaze as sort of putting something, it's almost on the edge of kitsch, almost too much, but at the same time, if you look more carefully, it's not talking about something that's that beautiful.
And we also have, if you look at the next slide, a detail of that piece if you want to see some of that closer up.
Yeah, what's amazing about this glaze when it's shiny is that you have all kinds of interior reflections, and then the piece reflects everything that's around it. But you can see it's just sort of it is a pile in that sense. And it's up to the viewer to decipher and find all these treasures within.
Right, sorry, I'm just trying to fix my audio a little bit. Yes, and I think maybe we want to talk a bit about those glazes, as you said, that sort of the holy grail there. And maybe the next slide if you have here, which is a Jaulnay piece.
Yeah, this is a gorgeous Jaulnay piece that's in LACMA's collection. And I stumbled upon, this is beautiful because let me just say, it was exciting to see it in person. And when you walk around a luster piece, it changes each time you see it. It changes with the light, it changes with your physical position. And I was able to kind of almost walk around it. And this green, this particular green is very similar to the green that we just saw in Gargantua, although this is a matte color and the other is shiny. But I've had the experience of being able to take that shiny glaze and bring it to matte and almost achieve this gorgeous yellow green. And I love the fact that the painting of this flower is very impressionistic and blending in. But as soon as, you know, I found out about Jaulnay because I realized that luster brings out every single texture in a work. Here you have a smooth surface which enabled the painter to paint these gorgeous flowers. But in my work, it's the physicality and the relief and the sculptural quality that brings out the different colors. And when I was at Kohler, I learned I was able to use their luster glazes. And then after that, I kind of went on a search for luster, and I found a book on Jaulnay at the Strand. And at the time, the Strand was my Google. I would sit down on the shelves and just pull out books in their glass and porcelain section. And sometimes I still do it, but it's not the same. So I pulled out this book on Jaulnay manufacture, opened it up, and I see what looks like psychedelic, contemporary, beautiful works that are almost Tiffany-like. And I thought to myself, I need that. I need to do that. And coincidentally, I was scheduled to go to Hungary in 2009 to a workshop in Kecskemét, but at the same time, I started to research the glaze called Eozyn. And I met somebody through the residency who connected me with a former worker at the factory. And the rest is kind of history, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But this is, I will also say about the iridescent glaze, and we can look at maybe the next slide. It is a proprietary glaze, it is a secret, and Jaulnay makes a big deal about it being a secret.
And I think there's a long history of secrecy in glazes in general, and in luster in particular. You know, it's obviously a complex process to make these surfaces, and something, you know, that has been passed on from craftsmen. And for this talk today, we actually spent some time looking at some earlier lusters. And we can come back to this piece in a sec, but maybe we want to look at the next slide.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah, and I have to say it was such a privilege to be in front of these pieces in the storage room. I mean, I really had to be here. I tried to see these works on Zoom and I was like, this is not working. You need to be in the presence of a pot. And with the shard, Yes, I love the luster, the level of detail, the layers of painting, the texture of the painting, the way it reflects the light is more copper when you see it in person. But I also really actually enjoyed looking at the edge of the shard to see the clay. It's so raw, and I like that contrast of the raw and the shiny, which I later bring into my work. And it happened, of course, by chance here. But like what I learned, obviously, is that luster originated even possibly before the 9th century in Persia. And some say it originated in Egypt, but then it traveled up through Africa to Spain, to Europe, and it basically got revived during the Art Nouveau period. But before that, it got revived in the 17th century in the next piece.
Right. I mean, there's a long history. I know that that there's been a lot of research about the origins of luster and how it traveled, of course, Iraq, Iran, throughout the Middle East, and then of course to Europe, sort of before even the revival in the 19th century. Of course, it was spread through Spain and Italy, through the Moors. So there's a long history, and this is something that has had such a long and enduring appeal to people. And I wondered if you could talk about sort of the appeal to you, and then moving also to the next slide to look at that vessel.
Well, I think the appeal is the magic. I mean, there are different layers of magic in working with clay. Some people may argue against it. If you know clay enough, it's not going to be a surprise. You know exactly what you're doing. On the other hand, with luster, you're constantly discovering new colors within colors. And when I saw this, I saw the beautiful pinks and coppers, and the turquoise is very seductive. But when I moved around this pot in storage, it was as if it was moving with me. The light was moving with me and following me. And I think there's an attraction to it. And during the Art Nouveau period, it was used again as a source of almost light. And I think that there's also a long history of alchemy, and even within the ceramics world itself, in every aspect of ceramics. But there's this desire to create gold, out of less precious metal. And I think that's one of the reasons that luster originated, was this attempt to create gold by using silvers and coppers. But this is a gorgeous, gorgeous piece.
Yes, and and I think one that you really can see all of the colors. It's one that I think has really really drawn us as well. And if you go to the next slide, I think you can then back to the Jolnai, looking again at the range of colors that you can see in this work. And I know we wanted to talk a little bit more about the Art Nouveau, about this period of revival in connection with your own work and with Pantagruel, which is the next slide.
Yes. What I loved, what I learned about Art Nouveau, I mean, first I learned about Jolnai, I wanted the glaze, and the fact is it opened up an entire chapter in history that didn't really feel like it had a beginning and an end, because maybe it starts in Persia, but then it continues on to contemporary art. And I was fortunate enough to be able to see a lot of the turn of the century Jolnai pieces. And this particular piece, Pantagruel, actually captures a very Art Nouveau feeling in terms not only of its color, but the use of animal forms to create, the curves. And this Art Nouveau was really interested in using every aspect of nature for design. And the Jolnai factory was very unique in that it was industrial. It was, revered for its, talent in creating industrial ceramics, but they also hired artists to make one-of-a-kind pieces. And that's what's really exciting. I keep collecting Jolnai books because there is no one book that captures everything that was made in that factory. And the snail also is really, there is a beautiful, we don't have the picture here, so I know it's not fair, but there have been some pieces that have snail feet in the Jolnai collection. There are ones that have snakes. You can see a snake wrapping itself around the head there. And I was interested in sort of the idea of the alien or the monstrous as a metaphor for something queer, or the LGBTQ community as the other. And so I'm very interested in that role of the monster. Whereas the snail, form I'm interested in because it is hermaphroditic. And that has a whole history where I've read a story called The Snail Watcher by Patricia Highsmith. But nonetheless, all that coding is in my work and it's not obvious at all. This looks like just some kind of, gorgeously glazed piece of nature.
Well, and I know the snail form was also occurs in Indigo Garden. We talked a little bit about that and about that sort of as a recurring motif in your work as something that, is coming in through the casting. So these things that we're talking about in a sense as being separate, you brought together, the casting in the Palissy tradition and obviously the glazes coming from Jolnai really are coming together in your work. And I wonder if you could talk about sort of the impact of having these glazes with this casting together and how that's, that comes together in your own mind.
Yeah, it just seemed perfect. I mean, when I'm casting, just for those who don't know, I was making press molds, but I learned at Kohler is they pour liquid clay into molds, and that's what they do at Jolnai. So I learned that technique at Kohler and was familiar with it. If I hadn't been to Kohler, I would never even, have asked to work at the Jolnai factory. But anyway, getting back to casting, it combines hand building and casting. So I'm using coils, I'm blending, I'm dripping the liquid clay on top, and the casting enables you to make multiples and to be really prolific. So, and it enabled me to achieve a certain level of realism. But it's very much about texture in the glaze, because you notice that the snail shells are shiny, the glaze is full of drips, and I knew that I would have a big variation of color as a result.
Well, I think that sense of variation and the surprise of luster is maybe something, if we could go, actually, we should talk about the next piece, but then also to the work of Beatrice Wood, which is, I know, someone else we wanted to talk about. As Beatrice Wood, of course, a California artist known for her work in luster, and somebody who was drawn actually to ceramics also through her interest in lusterware. She talks about having discovered Victorian Rococo lusterware plates, and that, of course, her interest in then making her own clay forms, and she became, known for this particular ceramic. But as somebody who talked about the fact that opening the kiln and finding that surprise, not knowing what you were going to see, was really important to her, not wanting that predictability. And I wonder if you could talk about that embrace of chance and of imperfection in your own work.
I will, and I also if you look, what draws me to Beatrice Wood's work is, of course, the luster. But once I get past the luster, of course, you look at the beauty of the forms, and seeing them in person is incomparable, because there's so many pinks and oranges, and they're very fragile, and yet they're powerful forms, such as the chalice, which she was drawn to. But if you'll see the imperfections on a plate, which is really not clear here, there's a huge drip and gob of glaze on the side. And I would never have known that if I had just seen this. There are dimples and bumps and lumps, and that is about something that is made by hand. And that's one reason that I love working in clay, is because of the hand. And I can feel that these are, and I also just wanted to talk about the fact that these are very performative, and the gold keeps them, and the luster just gives them this incredible life. But it's not just the luster, it's the irregularity of the form. It's very much alive. It asks you to pay attention to it. And in talking about performance, I really wanted my work to perform for me. And Beatrice Wood as a persona was really, almost a performance in herself, but she had to work a ton to achieve what she did. She didn't just, yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to connect the performative that I see in Beatrice Wood's work and in her persona to the snails and to my sculpture. The snails, for me, it's part of a performance as well. There's a sense of something coming alive. And Beatrice Wood has a fascinating life. We could talk more about her.
Her whole connection with the avant-garde and with Duchamp, but to keep the focus a bit more on you, I think, and on your practice. I think, it's interesting to think about luster and its connection to performance, that you're moving, as we talked about, moving around the works. It's not work that you look at in a static way.
Yes, very much. And, Jenny Sorkin was interesting. She writes about Beatrice Wood in terms of camp, because of that performativity. And when I made my work and I was drawn to the Jaune glaze, you may call it being on the edge of camp, but more for me, the edge of kitsch. But then the queering of the work comes in with the concept of the idea of glitter and what you wear to change your personality, to sort of become part of the burlesque, or, you know, the costuming. This is just a skin on a piece of clay, you know, it's a surface, but yet it transforms the entire form and meaning.
And did you want to talk a bit in terms of the coloring of this work? I know the
Oh,
previous
yeah.
slide we didn't touch on. If you want to go back one slide.
Oh, or to Labyrinth?
Maybe we put it the other way. I apologize. Let's go forward. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, the reason that we paired this is because of this gorgeous gold, but we are jumping ahead many years. However, so this is 2019, but I love the connection between the gold in this and the gold in Beatrice Wood's work in a very just pleasurable aesthetic way. And I went from making these scholars rocks to the monstrous forms to then deliberately bringing back female sexuality into my work. As you can see here, the labrys is, you know, a lesbian symbol, also ancient symbol, of course, and there are breast forms, eye forms. And to me, this piece is a portrait, but it also could be a portrait of more than one person, and kind of veering away just from one gender. So, but if you look at it, they are kind of platter-like discs that are shield-like. And when I look at Beatrice plates, I see the strength in them that, you know, reminds me of this. This is a wall piece. It's multi-part. It's body size, so that when you walk up to it, you really relate to it physically. That's very important to me. Even though when I'm making them, and this relates to, I think, the next slide,
Yes.
when I'm making them, I have to climb up on a table.
Oh, no, sorry.
Not yet. Okay. I'll back. Well, we can talk about this even with this. I have to climb up on a table and look down on them. And I'll bring that concept up again when we look at another slide, but we can go to, yeah. Next.
But where I thought you were going was in terms of, you know, sort of the body and the relationship and tactility of form, which is what we were thinking about with the work of Eva Zeisel, which is the next slide.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, so if we could go, Holly, to the next slide then, actually this time. We have the, you know, thinking about Eva Zeisel, who was working in functional form, but, you know, but really was aware of and interested in the emotional content of those pieces. I'm wondering if we're having some trouble with the next slide here. Oh, okay, so let's keep going.
Okay, keep going. There was one other dish that was before this. It's before this one, I think. Yeah, perfect. So this is a really fascinating story. But first, let's talk about the relationship between the body and the biomorphic form that Eva Zeisel, when she designed, she's a designer who designed utilitarian things and was adamant that they felt good to hold and that they conveyed an emotion. Even when she taught industrial ceramics at Pratt, a program that she started, she wanted her students' work to convey that. And indeed, I got to know Eva when she was maybe 104 through my Hungarian teacher, because she held court regularly in her apartment in the Upper West Side. And what I found out is that she was almost blind at that time. She couldn't hear very well, but she continued to design, and she had assistants. Like, looking at the spoon reminds me of it. She had an assistant make a spoon for her, and the assistant would carve it out of plaster or wood, and then Eva would hold it and say, no, you need to take away more here, or you need to add more there. For her, the weight is very important, how you lift the spoon to your mouth. And I was so privileged to meet Eva, and her whole story is interesting to me, but the connection to Zsolnay is that in 1983, she was asked to make a series of works there. And I basically tried to connect the family with Zsolnay, and that's another long story. But I really feel that Eva's works to this day are very contemporary. And I love the relationship that she has to sculpture, to the art, but she really wanted her work to be affordable.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting, and you know, in thinking about some of these own concepts with your work, we talked a little bit about that tactility that, her pieces were meant to be handled and held, but obviously, your work as a sculptor is often something experienced visually by most people. And how do you bring that sense of tactility into your own practice?
That's a good question. And even going back to the Beatrice Wood, it's the irregularity. I'm not worried about sanding something. If there's a lump left here or a little spot there, I just leave it, because I'm in the process of making, there's sort of this frantic energy of getting it done and changing and editing and changing and editing. And it's messy. And I really like the messiness. I just leave it that way. So I think there you can sense the body and the artist's presence in the work. And you maybe, unfortunately, can't touch it unless, of course, I say, touch it. Oh, one funny story was I was in this show called Paul Klee in New York City. And a friend of mine saw the show and saw where my work was. And she thought to herself, oh my God, this is like so hidden. And she actually lifted it and moved it. And so, so she kind of broke that sacred barrier. And I am thankful to her ever since. But anyway.
Well, in sort of just one more note on Eva Zeisel, if we want to go then to the next slide, Rainbow Dream Machine. I know that you made a direct homage to her work.
Yes, this was a really exciting piece for me because it was the first horizontal piece that's kind of related to the mural. But if you look on the left, or my left, I suppose it is, that is a direct reference to Eva Zeisel's belly button vase. And they are gorgeous. And this is a vase that she designed at the Jolnay factory. And I was lucky enough years later to be able, well, no, actually it was that year, 2019, to trade one of my pieces for one of them. And I absolutely treasure it. And she made a whole series. And I think they're directly related to the body as well. It's called a belly button vase after all. And I encourage everybody to look up Eva's work. This piece was very much about the body, but trying to incorporate some elements of the mechanical, as you see the wrench there, an homage to labor. I've been looking a lot at socialist modernist works in Hungary, and they have had a big influence on me. That's not to say that I support the government that supported those works, but that I support the artists who's, for some of them, it was their only way to express their creativity and make a living. It's a very complicated topic. But this was, of course, very purposefully sexualized and sensualized. And you can see in the bottom, there's a keyhole form, which I brought back from my work from the 90s that is about voyeurism and sexuality. And there's coding throughout.
Mm-hmm. Well, in thinking about sort of the, these bodily forms and sort of the many different layers of them, perhaps we could go to the next slide. I know we talked a bit about sort of the biomorphic and body forms. Of course, Ruth Duckworth herself, the artist of this piece, didn't frame her work that way. She framed her work, sort of more elemental and essential forms. But I think that the physical and the human body is something that many people have related in her work. And I wonder if you could talk about this piece and the experience of seeing it, because I know there were some surprises when we saw it in person together.
Yes, this really is an example of why you have to see the piece. It actually is layered. So those shadows are created because there's a recess underneath that panel. It's multi-leveled, and there are hollows underneath the porcelain slabs that you can only see if you kind of get under and look at it. And I think it's the shadow and light play again that brings it alive, but also these rounded forms that keep you moving throughout the piece. And of course, they remind me of breasts and bellies, and the surfaces are gorgeous. They're smooth like skin, or marble, in fact, which harkens back to the history of marble figurative sculptures, fragmented. And it is, I just want to say one little anecdote, that there was a piece hanging at the Museum of Art and Design by Ruth Duckworth, and I would make a pilgrimage to that just as much as I would make a pilgrimage to the Palissy at the Met, which I want to mention, and it's not there anymore. But I also want to add that what I found out when I did a bit of research about Ruth Duckworth is that she created a studio so that either there was a hole in the wall or there was a balcony so she could look down on her work. She made everything on the floor and had to envision it on the wall, which is what I do as well. And so it is kind of precarious, getting on the table, getting on the ladder. what I've had to do, and thanks to the iPhone, is I take tons of photographs throughout the process of making my work, so that I take it home and look at it and live, breathe, eat it, dream it. And yeah, and so you really have to imagine how these pieces are going to be, just like you have to imagine what they might be like with their glaze. And that brings me to something else, which is when the piece comes out of the kiln, to me, it really is like a new piece, and I have to live with it. Sometimes I hate it, and it might take months or never before I like it. So that's something that I think probably happens to a lot of ceramic artists who work in clay.
Right. And well, and then thinking about, sort of your own work and your own experiences, I know the next couple of slides we have are some of your own wall works. If you want to move forward to that. Do you want to talk a bit about this?
Yeah. We paired this with Duckworth because this is really high relief, and I love the way that she does the high relief. Although this is different, this is incorporating elements of the body even more with the idea of the machine, which brings us back to Art Deco and their fascination with the mechanical. I was thinking more of films like Metropolis, where you have this costume that, the characters wear, in which human and machine almost merge. And Oscar Schlemmer also does that in his work. But for me, I was really interested. This is also a double portrait, and the spherical forms are everywhere, like in Ruth Duckworth. But the lines and I take the drawing from my work and put it in, those are lines and slabs. And so there really are layers you can look through, which I guess is similar to Duckworth in the sense of there are parts that you can't see.
Well, it's interesting too with her work, because her work has this sort of perfection, pristine quality to it. Almost, you almost feel like, I think you said, like you're looking like a marble form, but with your work, you're getting at the machine in a very different way. Through something that still has that handmade energy to it.
True. And I think in this case, the machine implies performance again, because you might think of automata, the mechanized dolls, which leads us to thinking about robots. And so that was the time Metropolis was made was a very optimistic time. And we're in a very different time right now. So in a sense, this is a bit nostalgic, but it gave me the freedom to kind of invent my own figure, my own gender, or my own way of interpreting the body.
If we want to then move also to the next one.
And this is Purple Warrior, and it's again a portrait. And I was very influenced by Vasarely. There's a tiny little part there, the breasts, that are like Vasarely's circles within squares. And I go see his museum every time I'm in Page, Hungary, where I work. And every time I gather something new. So this work really derived from Vasarely and from my drawings, and from looking at Hungarian paintings during the 70s so much. Again, it's also like a puzzle. And making these is really fun, because I might start out with a drawing, roll out the clay, draw it, and then erase and draw and erase and draw. And even when I'm starting to bring up the pieces, meaning put in the walls and make it more 3D, I still change it and edit it. I don't know if I answered your question, but
I think this one too, I think we were talking a bit about the history and about some of the politics and some of the the things you're trying to address in your work, because I think that leads us to the next few pieces, which throughout this presentation we've talked a little bit about the technique of building, we've talked about your glazes, but I know for you and your work, you also have you put a lot of thought into the messages that you're sending, and through your choice of media and through your choice of glazes. And so I didn't know if you wanted to comment on that with this work, or if you wanted to move on to the next one.
No, I'll comment on this one, because basically this is called Purple Warrior because it's inspired by the utopian idea of what you might call Amazons now, although that word has been kind of, well, let's just say altered. And if you look at Monique Wittig wrote this book, two books. One's The Lesbian Body and one is Les Guerrières. And this is one of the guerrières, which means warrior, and warrior in the positive sense of strength. And I wanted these figures to be almost part of a frieze so that if you go into a room, you'll see the room lined with these figures. And that, of course, takes us back to architectural ceramics and the relationship to the space, the relationship to the body. And it's very important to me that, you know, the queerness and I was very interested in lesbian visibility. I have been and I continue to be, but in these pieces that may not be obvious to the viewer or to every audience. And that's okay. But I intentionally was thinking about that at the time because of the homophobia in Hungary. And little did I know, you know, I started using symbols, sexual symbols, or symbols of female sexuality rather, in 2016. Little did I know what was going to happen here.
Right.
But I think that it's true for many artists, no matter what medium they work in, they can create something political without it being full of obvious symbols that I could say create symmetry, and that can refer to homoeroticism for me.
Right, and this idea of using our art and form as a way of forging identity, I think will take us to our next piece here from the collection, which is the work, this one and the following piece, we'll look at both of them, by the Latvian artist Roman Suta, and these were made as part of the Balters workshop in the early days of Latvian independence as part of this project to establish, you know, Latvian identity using the art, that, you know, it was important to this group of artists to use modern forms as a way of showing Latvia as a modern country. And I wondered, this, I know for you were a discovery when you looked at LACMA's collection, that these are not works that are seen widely in the United States. Maybe we can take a look at the next one as well. And maybe you could comment on your response to them when you saw them and what they brought up for you.
I just want to say part of this fantastic experience of having access to your database of works in your storage room and then getting to see them was to learn about something totally new. And I had never heard of the Baltars group or Roman Suta, and these were made in the 1920s, as you see. And I was immediately drawn to them because of not only the content, which includes folk art and national identity, but the way that Art Deco is used and modernism is used and abstraction is used, as well as the plate form, to tell almost multiple stories at the same time. I think this multiplicity of images in a grandiose way is fascinating, that can be captured on a plate.
Right.
And because of and Judy Chicago does it too. I mean, you know, it's amazing. It's like
then
with the plate, you kind of continually go round and round it. And I will just say that it's so exciting to learn about a new group of artists. They were a small group that worked in a basement, were supported by a philanthropist, and wanted to represent Latvia's industrial growth. At the same time, they really wanted to bring art and painting into ceramics. And it's very similar also to the agitprop work made in Russia. Sadly, well, Latvia was independent for a short amount of time before it became subsumed. But
Zupa, of course, had studied in Russia, as had the others in the group. But just before we get too far into that, I know we're getting close to time, and I know you wanted to make sure we talked about the next work, since you referenced Judy Chicago, and thinking about the next slide here, and thinking about artists using ceramics and you know towards political statements. And I wonder if you could talk about what interested you in this particular work. And I know we also have another image, if you want to get to the next slide, so we can see a little closer up on what she's doing here.
Yeah, this is Judy Chicago's, China painting, which was really most often the domain of women. But this is from the Birthing Project. But I really was fascinated. I came across this looking at your collection and didn't realize that she had made almost an altar. Mm-hmm. I had been very influenced by the dinner party, which I saw in 1979 at the Cyclorama in Boston. And at the time, it was incredibly exciting. Then I went through a period of rejecting Judy Chicago, as some people did. Now I'm embracing her once again, literally, I think, with the forms that I've created in the next piece, which is an homage to her work in the dinner party. I was so excited to see these, by the way, the biomorphic forms, the sexuality is incredibly direct. There's no skirting around it. And I love that boldness, you know, in her designs. So if you go to the next slide, psychedelic body, the last panel, is really specifically an homage to the dinner party, with these, you know, sort of well in the middle. And it's hard to see the dimensionality of that third panel, but it is there. And this came before the shaped pieces, where I really wanted to create a portrait of a body, not just a bust. So anyway, I'm happy to talk about any of these if people have questions, or Staci, maybe.
I think maybe if we want, I think just looking at time, I don't know if there are any questions from the audience, or if not.
I see something in the Q&A.
Let's see here.
But I think it's a statement, yeah.
Right, the physical, talking a little bit about the clay and the physical presence, and, you know, sort of your comment that glass was not a media that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for asking this question. I think what draws me to clay is the tactility, is the rawness of it, is the playfulness of it. And I know that so many people now are drawn to clay. And I wanted to say that clay is very accessible. It's accessible to the amateur, it's accessible to the painter, it's accessible to the professional, of course, too. You can just dive right in, and the instinct is to pinch it and pull it. And for me, it was also carving it. And there's a very physical, visceral satisfaction of just working with the material. There can be frustration, of course, but you can always rebuild. That's the thing about clay. It's not precious. You can just throw it in the, you know, bin and then come up with some new clay and try again. So I think that it's a relief from Zoom and virtual life as we are experiencing it now. But it's also communal. Ceramics often are made in a group studio, and that's very important. For me, working in the factory was important because of that as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, the incredible range of clay is really evident in the works you selected. I mean, we have things here that were, you know, centuries old and functional works, and we have works that, you know, were modernist statements. We have works here that, you know, were obviously, you know, much more recent, and, you know, about feminism. I think what you can see in the works that you selected, of course, is the breadth of things that you as an artist are looking at, and also just the incredible variety of the media. And that's something that we were excited about with this exhibition, an opportunity to really think about those dialogues across time.
Yes.
So
I see something that says, what inspired you to become a ceramicist as a young adult? Do you see that, Staci? I think I'll.
Oh, I see that. And then, yeah, if you want to respond to that one, and then I see one other question here.
Okay, try to be quick, but what I want to say is that when I was a kid, I grew up in Burlington, Vermont, and used to hang out at the University of Vermont. And it's a long story, but a certain door was open, and that door led to a basement, which was a pottery shop in Williams Hall. And I used to just hang out and watch the potters until someone said that I could babysit for their child in exchange for clay. And that experience really became mirrored in the one on Hope Street in Williamsburg, when I went in and said, does anybody know how to make a mold of an octopus? It's very similar, that I was given this amazing opportunity as a kid, as a teenager, then to come every day to the studio. I never took a class. I was mentored by people in the 1970s who were given the opportunity to work in the shop by a phenomenal human being named Hideo Okino. And one day he just asked me, well, do you want to work here? And I said, okay. So for several summers, I just came and rode my bike up there and did my thing. But I immediately went to sculpture. I started with pots and then went to sculpture.
Yeah, I think that sort of generosity is just an important part of how the media spreads and everything like that. The last question I think we have time for here is how do you tackle the difference between glaze and its result versus what you'd hope for? And do you accept the result according to the laws of alchemy, or do you ever remake a piece because the clay did more than the glaze? And I think that sort of goes back to what you're talking about with Beatrice Wood, who talked about the joy of the surprise, but perhaps it's not always a joy. And maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, there are times when I don't like a work and I definitely do reglaze it. But I have an experience where I work with an engineer in Hungary, not just the factory. I've worked with him for years. And, you know, when you work with somebody, it's more like a collaboration. When you work with a factory, it's a collaboration. There can be misunderstandings. I mean, I had to learn more Hungarian so that I could talk to the person who sprays the glaze. So I could talk to the glaze chemist, even though I wasn't given the recipe. I could say, let's try for this, for this, for this. And you wouldn't believe there are tons of misunderstandings, but then you get surprises. So that is part of the process. And yes, sometimes it's a reject, but that's okay. I think we have to get rid of this idea of preciousness. At least I do with clay, and clay it's sort of inherent in the material.
Yeah, and I also love, you reference offhand that you had to learn Hungarian, but
Yeah.
I think the one thing that came out, in our conversations about luster and studying luster is, that it was a media that for so many chemists and artists and engineers over time, that there was such a quest to create that. And I think that sort of sense of, as you said, the holy grail, seeking something beautiful is something that really comes through in your work. And I think it's been really a pleasure to take this trail through time with you, looking at all these different works, both the history of your career and also just the history of the media. And so thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so very, very much, Staci. It's been wonderful. Thank you.